Hello, I'm Olivia Zepeda. This is my project. It's a timeline of people who worked regarding motion. So Aristotle. All things that move are moved by something else. Everything is naturally at rest. Something bigger than it must move it. It must also have the ability to be moved. That's an important aspect. And heavier objects fall faster. He has a concept of speed, but not necessarily like a good definition of what speed is, because he's a natural philosopher. So he just kind of comes up with these ideas based on observations. He doesn't actually do any kind of testing or find any evidence for anything. He philosophizes them. So STRATO of LAMPSACUS. That was a picture of him with Aristotle, actually, or a painting. He believes that in like an atheist kind of view, where with Aristotle, once you get down to a certain, where you go back to a certain point, the like initial movement was from this like godly figure. He doesn't believe that you need that for motion. You don't need something to make things move, they just kind of move. He also kind of looks at acceleration, not just things being fast, but being faster. And then we're going to skip a long period of time, and we're going to see the pre-13th century. Motion has to do with the new idea of like inertia, or not inertia, of entropy. The idea that, you know, it's getting closer to like death. Essentially, as you move, not that you move more, you're going to be closer to death, but you move because you're in the process of living, which is getting closer to dying. Whereas William of Ockham, if you've ever heard of Ockham's razor, it's that guy. He believes it's a set of successive positions occupied by a moving object, which sounds pretty obvious to us, but it was rejected by all of his contemporaries because of what Aristotle said about things having to be bigger. And just, it's weird. It's really weird. And then you get four really cool guys called the Oxford calculators, because they studied at a college in Oxford. And they liked to do different math stuff, so they're called calculators. They did a ton of stuff. They distinguished between kinetics and dynamics, so instead of focusing on what makes motion happen, they focused on how the motion moves. That's a pretty important part of motion, but they came up with it. Velocity, instantaneous velocity, acceleration, and actually defining what that is and how to measure it and whatnot, but they never actually did anything with any of this. They just kind of discovered it, came up with all the equations and everything, and then never applied it to anything. It was purely math. The natural philosophy and math had not come together to form science yet, so they didn't test anything. They just did lots of math problems. And then Galileo Galilei comes in and says, I can apply that to real life, and you see free fall. You know, the apple falling on Newton's head, you know, like, that's a free fall. So he worked on the stuff they did and a bunch of other stuff, and decided to actually test his free fall theory that weight doesn't affect it. And he took an iron ball and a wooden ball and went to the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped it, and those are my cats. That was spooky scary. Oops. So Isaac Newton, the Apple guy we talked about. Yep. 3 laws of motion. Y'all know what that is. Law of gravity, we talked about that. And then he did a bunch of math stuff he didn't have to do, and didn't have the capability of doing anything with that information. Like, how is he going to put a cannonball into the orbit? We barely can, honestly. And then he also believed in this thing called absolute motion and relative motion. Relative motion is what we call motion. Things moving in relation to one another, but absolute motion is like a real force makes a real motion, because forces are metaphysical entities again, kind of like a supernatural, otherworldly kind of thing, and that's what causes movement. And then George Berkeley showed up and said, I don't get what this absolute motion is, that's not real. Because that's weird. Because that's not motion. It doesn't exist. Don't worry about it. You don't need to know what absolute motion is because it's weird. But he thought it had to do with centrifuge. Yeah. He did that. That's what he did.